Dag allemaal, hallo. Wat ontzettend fijn dat u er allemaal bent, hier en thuis, voor deze eerste echt grote bijeenkomst. Voor ons in ieder geval als uitgeverij. Mijn naam is Jasper Henderson, uitgever van Thomas Rapp. En we zijn ontzettend blij en dankbaar voor Spui 25, dat we in samenwerking met de uitgeverij dit weer kunnen organiseren. Heel lang hebben we natuurlijk geen dit soort evenementen kunnen doen. Nu kan het weer. En ook heel erg lang, denk 1,5, bijna 2 jaar alweer, hebben we geen buitenlandse auteurs kunnen ontvangen. En dat is wat we ontzettend graag doen. Als we geloven in de boeken die wij kopen, natuurlijk uit wat voor land dan ook, proberen we de auteur hier naartoe te krijgen. Nou, dat is nu voor het allereerst weer gelukt met de man hier links van mij in het blauwe jasje, Menachem Kaiser. Die debuteerde met het boek Plunder. En wat wij gaan uitgeven, deze week verschijnt het aanstaande donderdag onder de titel De Nalatenschap. Het boek is nog niet verkrijgbaar, pas aanstaande donderdag. Maar er is iets prachtigs aan de hand, namelijk dat boekhandel Atheneum deze kaartjes hier verspreidt, waarmee u via die QR-code met 10% korting reeds het boek kan kopen. En dat kunt u of ophalen bij een van de filialen, of thuisgestuurd krijgen. De service is ongekend, dank daarvoor. Er is één technisch probleempje. U in de zaal hoort mij goed via deze microfoon en straks ook via deze mannen links van mij. Maar thuis moet u een beetje beter luisteren, want dit is eigenlijk de enige microfoon die op dit moment het doet. Maar het moet allemaal te horen zijn en ik hoop dat u erbij blijft. Menachem schreef een prachtig boek met de nalatenschap. Daarover gaan 2 andere mensen straks meer gaan vertellen, namelijk zijn interviewers. Helemaal links zit daar George Blaustein. Hij is universitair docent aan de UvA in de Amerikaanse en geschiedenis. Hij is essayist en publicist, schrijft boeken. En is medeoprichter met de man in het midden, Sander Pleij, van de European Review of Books. Daarover later vast meer. Sander is ook journalist en schreef de debuutroman enige tijd geleden Explicador. Het is nog steeds leverbaar. Dat gezegd hebbende wens ik u veel plezier met deze eerste echt openbare interview en lezing voor zowel de auteur als de uitgeverij. Hartelijk welkom nogmaals uw aandacht voor George Blaustein, Sander Pleij en uiteraard Menachem Kaiser.
I think we should go there. Let's make it a festive moment. So George can introduce the book. I'm just here to separate these Americans a little bit to make things understandable for us. George.
Thanks. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you, Jasper, and thank you, Janneke, also for arranging this and the build-up to this day. I know some people are watching online from the US, so I'll say a quick introduction of myself in English and Sander. I'm George Blaustein. I teach history and American studies at the UvA. Sander is a wonderful novelist and writer, and we are co-creators of something called the European Review of Books, which is one reason why this book appealed to us. I will give a cryptic introduction to Plunder. The American title of the book is, or the English title of the book is Plunder, a Memoir of Family Property and Nazi Treasure. Without giving too much away, I will say that the book does surprising and complicated things with each of those words. The treasure, I will not describe, treasurers, I suppose we could say, but I will work backwards through the other words, Nazi, property, family, memoir, and plunder. Family, property, and or Nazi. Nazi. This is a book about the Holocaust and how we approach it. It is also about the afterlives of Nazism in geography, politics, and architecture, especially the Nazi Project Riese, the massive, mysterious system of underground tunnels and caverns constructed in the last 2 years of the war in the mountains of Silesia by enslaved laborers. Property. The book begins with a grandson's quest to reclaim a building in the Polish city of Sosnowiec, or Sosnovia, I forgive my pronunciation of that city, to reclaim a building in that Polish city that had been taken from his grandfather. But property becomes a shifting and abstract thing, not only because all property is theft, but because the specific property in question shifts, and because different histories are laid over the same plot of land, like a palimpsest. Different legal regimes as well. Our narrator navigates the bureaucracies of post-communist Poland. After communism had, in theory, suspended private property, the politics are not simple. Family. The narrator's own family history expands and disperses as the plot unfolds. Meanwhile, what happens when a memoir of family property becomes a memoir of some other family's property? That's one of the questions of this book, such as the Polish families living in what may or may not be the right building. Memoir. This is a memoir, yes, but it is a highly self-conscious one, highly self-conscious as about the form of the memoir. Nabokov is mentioned once. Here's my proposition for you that you can take this up or argue with me about it. We might think of this book as a melancholy tournament of genres. There is the genre of, well, the genre of Holocaust memoir is approached in a particularly poignant way as a genre. There are other genres too, a legal drama. Charles Dickens's Bleak House came to mind, about a family legal case that has lasted so long that generations of lawyers have worked on it. There's also a Kafkaesque novel of trial and bureaucracy that figures in here. A Gothic novel with haunted houses into which a naive Canadian is thrown. There would be another way of describing it. Self-consciously naive. And of course, a treasure hunt, but a highly ironic and ambivalent one. This is a book about the pathology of treasure hunting that itself adopts, maybe must adopt, elements of that pathological genre. In that sense, it has a noir quality, wherein an innocent or righteous protagonist, a good cop in a film noir, for example, takes on some of the traits of what he is chasing. So then finally, plunder. Who is plundering whom when the layers of plunder are bottomless? Silesia is historically a region of mining and extraction. This book reflects ultimately on different kinds of reading, on what we take from books, on what we extract from books. I don't think I'm saying anything. The things I'm saying, the author would, I think, is entirely conscious of. That introduction that I just gave probably makes the book seem unwieldy or experimental or difficult, but in fact it flows. It is vivid and strange. I hope we get into some of those strange details in our conversation. And it's also a warm book, and I think we can give Menachem Kaiser a warm welcome. So now, since I've done one introduction, I can ask for more applause. With that, I'll hand it over to Sander to ask some questions with one line from the novel that I liked, a good line about language. One point where we read, "They didn't speak English and I don't speak Polish. Andrei knew a smattering of German and I had taken 4 semesters of Yiddish in college, which meant we could pretend we were communicating." And I thought that's a good motto for a public interview of this sort. Thank you.
It was a different book, I think, in Dutch, because I read it in Dutch. It was a very exciting thriller kind of, literary thriller kind of read. Is the translator maybe here?
No.
I loved the translation. It was really a great translation. I loved it, for example, because the translator Fred Hendricks gave us the word muilpeer.
Yeah.
So beautiful. It's a
word?
face slap. It's when you hit yourself in the face, or you get hit in the face with you get yourself a muilpeer.
I am curious where.
And also that he translated explorers. He said explorers. He translated it for he says explorers, where you write explorers, and that was also lovely, because otherwise you would think of something like grave diggers or ontdekkingsreiziger or something. He was very nice. First, it's very difficult to not give too much away of your story. Could you just give us a little tiny thought of the plot of what actually happens in the book?
Sure.
Because we were afraid we would give too much away.
How much do you want to give away?
I'm okay with spoilers. When I read, I'm fine. What do you say?
It's not about you.
Not just spoiled, Elaine.
Yeah, I don't mind. I'll try to keep it, but if things will get spoiled, and go read the book and see what I spoiled. So basically the book follows 2 narratives that start getting entangled in complicated ways. I would say that the core narrative is my ongoing attempt to reclaim property that had belonged to my great-grandfather, that which I find out that my grandfather, the rightful heir, tried and failed to reclaim pretty much his entire post-war life until he died in 1977. Sort of what's going on behind that story is that I never knew my grandfather, and not only that, I really never knew anything about him. He died when my father was about 24. He died 8 years before I was born, and so he wasn't he didn't die before the war, but it was just something that I never got a sense of who he was, and I certainly never got any sense of his wartime history. And so that's kind of going on throughout. I would say that's the backbone of the book. And that involves, I'd say, moral complications, legal complications, logistics complications, my own series of errors and mishaps, my lawyer's series of errors and mishaps, the legal systems, whatever you want to call them, mishaps, I don't know. And then, so that's kind of continuing on, that's a through line. Surrounding that is, I end up finding out that I have a relative I didn't know I had. So up until that point, I was under the impression that my grandfather's entire family, so his immediate family and his extended family, everyone had died during the war. And then through an unrelated coincidence, I was sitting with a bunch of treasure hunters. We could get into how that happened.
Yes.
Let me say quickly what happened. Okay, well, yeah. I was kind of sitting with a bunch of treasure hunters, and I found out that they mythologized a man named Menachem Kaiser, who turned out to be my grandfather's first cousin, i.e. his closest surviving relative. And he was a very, very big deal among these treasure hunters, which we'll describe in a second. And I, in turn, became a celebrity in my own right. And I was kind of embraced by this community of treasure hunters they kind of went with the narrative that I was his grandson. And eventually I just conceded, and I'm like, yes, I'm the grandson. I became, a really big deal in the treasure hunter community. And so these two kind of narratives start bleeding together in interesting ways that even I didn't anticipate when I started writing the book. But eventually I would say this like mixed up swirl becomes the book as a whole.
Yes, that's good description. You first you're in how do I pronounce the name of the city that you go to? Sosnowiec, or Sosnow, if you want to be real Yiddish about it. Okay, you go there. Yeah. And then you, from there on, you go to the place where the treasure hunters gather. That's, we call it reis.
Yeah. It's nice, by the way, you guys are the first interviewers to pronounce it right.
Really?
Yes.
Americans just terrible other interviewers.
Yeah, they just go straight for reis.
It's awful.
You're telling me. Yeah.
In reis, we all know reis because a few years ago it got a lot of fame because there was the golden train of the Nazis.
The Americans forgot about that right away.
We did it. Yeah. It was supposedly hidden in the caves under the mountains, the Owl Mountains. How is it called?
Owl Mountains, yeah.
Owl Mountains. You go there. You meet with a bunch of treasure hunters that have been in that area for decades, searching for treasures of the Nazis, and then you kind of at first you do not, but in the end you find out that you have a lot more in common with these treasure hunters than you would like.
Quite a bit.
Could you describe the first scene where a treasure hunter invites you to his house and shows you all these memorabilia?
Sure. So I'll say, like, for those who, most of you, I'm assuming, haven't read the book, I went for the treasure hunters because I was curious. It was pure curiosity. I had read about this golden train, and the media at the time in 2015, the whole world covered this story. But they didn't really, there was no golden train, so what were they taking pictures of? They ended up taking pictures of Project Riese, which are these like stupendous, spectacular underground caverns with these kind of beefy, mustachioed Polish treasure hunters. And so very compelling figures. And I was just, at the time I was writing a novel, and I thought I could incorporate these guys into that novel. And so I reached out, I made meetings with some of them with a guide. But really, I didn't think it would, in a million years, it had nothing to do with me or my ongoing family, ongoing reclamation efforts. It was really unrelated. And then I sat with them, and through this, I found out I was related to this guy, Menachem Kaiser. So that first time, so the thing is, when they found out I was Abraham's relative, it was an explosion. It wasn't just like, all the guys I'd been in touch with immediately started inviting me to everything. But the main one, this guy, Andre, who becomes my protagonist of sorts, sort of the main treasure hunter, he was very insistent. He's like, come to my house to see my treasure. And it turns out it wasn't actually his house. It was a second house. He lived like a couple miles away, and he built a home just to house his treasure. So it really was like a private museum. Something between like a man cave and a private museum. He actually had a room in there, which he slept in, which was full of objects, mostly Nazi paraphernalia. And so he invited me over, we sat in, it's like a wood paneled living room with like everywhere there's like all these artifacts, museum quality artifacts. Very strange, something like a Reichsadler, like a giant Nazi eagle, like with a swastika on its talons. And then he invites me to like the inner sanctum, and there's kind of a wall of a glass cabinet, and inside they're just, and it's arranged very artfully, and it's organized. And so you have the Nazi currency, he has a weird collection of fake eyes, a ton of like ballistics and like bullets and missiles, tank shrapnel, lots of helmets, not just Nazi ones, British ones and American ones, these old beautiful atlases. He found like an old collection of atlases from like the early 20th century that were hidden during the war. He showed me a lot of, he wouldn't show me some stuff actually, which was very surprising. He had a collection of watches, grenades that he promised were disarmed, guns that he promised were disarmed, many things that he promised were disarmed. But he said that with a weird smile. I believe him for most of them. Just a tremendous, sword, sabers, one that he claimed was from the Napoleonic times, old coins. It's just like an endless list of actual literal treasure.
So at that moment you're the descendant of a Jewish person that lost all his building. You're coming to reclaim the building, or you're coming to find out what the building is. But then you find yourself in this mountain with this treasure hunter with all this Nazi stuff.
Yeah.
What at that moment did you realize there's something going quite wrong at this moment?
It's a lot to process. So my initial reaction when someone's like, "Hey, come into my room," and you see a private museum, I don't think about me right away. I was like, "What is going on here?" And so my process kind of resembled. First, I was very taken aback, but I ended up sort of approaching these guys' collections very differently than I had initially. Initially, I felt like I think anyone who grew up like where I grew up, who sees someone who fetishizes Nazi paraphernalia. You're kind of horrified, you're kind of confused, you don't understand it. Eventually, I came to realize that they have a very different connotation with these objects. That it's not the same. If I walked into some guy in the Midwest, in like the US, and he had a room full of swastikas, I don't care where he got them from. I'm going to find that very aggressive, let's say, to put it the least. There it was very different. Especially, it became clear how much they hated Nazis. They really voiced their opposition and their hatred towards Nazis, not current day Germans, to a degree that was actually disturbing.
There were trophies.
They were scalps or trophies.
Scalps.
They were something, yeah, and they saw it as something different. They found it as literal plunder.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so then you get into that community, you get to meet more of these people, then you find out that they are all conspiracy theorists. So, and then could you tell me a little bit about that? Because I love the moment that you introduced an essay by Richard Hofstadter, The Paranoid Style in American Politics.
Sure.
Yeah?
So I started hanging out with this community of treasure hunters, and it's a large community. I would say if you include the hobbyists, it's easily over 100,000 people. And they have a magazine that has a circulation of over 20,000 or something like that.
I love that magazine, to see
Kritza.
the magazine.
Yeah, you get it online. It's a very strange one. They're actually reviewing the book soon, which I'm very excited about. Yeah.
Just name a few of their conspiracy theories.
So I started hanging out with them, and I started hearing these very bizarre things, which I dismissed. They started talking about like UFOs, like Nazi UFOs, flying saucers, time travel, anti-gravity, nuclear weapons, moon bases, and like Nazi bases in Antarctica, South America, stuff, communications with ancient civilizations, stuff with the occult, magic. And my initial thing was like, this is weird and silly, and who cares? Like, what's the point of delving into this? It's going to hurt my brain, and I'm not going to get to the bottom of Nazi time travel. Like, I'm not going to figure out how it works. I don't care. But eventually, these sort of beliefs and conspiracy theories were so endemic and so widespread that I was like, if I'm trying to understand this community, I have to at least attempt to figure out what's behind this. So that is by far the most research-intensive chapter of the book. I would say I spent 6 solid months researching conspiracy theories and hiring research assistants to help me out in the languages I didn't read, mostly Polish, but a little bit German as well. And I found it to be, even though the conspiracy theories are as trivial and frivolous, they can have a very pernicious underside, something very, very dangerous. I found a sort of moral relativism at work, a sort of a way that narrates the war in a way that is very alien, but also very dangerous. And because it sort of rebalances the war's moral weight. If the story of the war becomes one of technological accomplishments, whether it be flying saucers or a time machine, the victimhood and the aggression start becoming minimized. And it's not a surprise that you see actually a lot of Holocaust deniers, especially some very famous ones, including Urjundo, start their career with these kind of Holocaust conspiracy theories, including like werewolves, like stuff that's very silly, but when you see what's going underneath, it becomes a very dangerous draw to certain people with certain beliefs. And this started hitting home while I was writing the book. Conspiracy theories started becoming a much bigger topic. Yeah. And we actually, I think, in the US, but all over the world, you could see the dangers all of a sudden. So the example I cite very briefly in the book is the shooter in Pittsburgh, who believed in some conspiracy theories that are outlandish, but yet he was motivated by them.
There was a step before what happens to someone that over there that gets into a conspiracy theory. There's a moment before that, and it was about our cultural obsession with the Nazis. I felt a little bit guilty. I thought, I also want to know about that train, and I want to know more. And I hope he will even find something. At certain moments you're also looking for some stuff. And I love the notion, and I thought that came out of the essay that I just mentioned, about conspiracy theories originating from the unimaginability of the Holocaust.
Yeah.
The Holocaust is something so big, we cannot imagine it. It's easier to understand the flying UFO.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it puts a lot of stress on your psyche, both as an individual and as a collective. And you start seeing, you see it in actually mainstream media. Like if you go to the History Channel, they're not showing victims, they're not showing the stories of the victims. They're showing wild and zany Nazi stories. And like that's what attracts attention, and that's what there's kind of an endless appetite for it. Or you see even like the Nazi sci-fi trope, which it's been around for 30 years, and like it's constant. There's the new movies being made are not necessarily valorizing, but there's an underside to it. Like even if they're silly or crazy or sci-fi, those stories always gain a lot of traction. And I think they're harmless on its own, but when taken into context, again, what stories are we emphasizing? What stories are we under-emphasizing or de-emphasizing? And that was like a big shock to me. Like I considered these things to be very trivial. After spending all this time in the research, there's a danger there, but it's a subtle one.
The way in the book you confront the reader with this is something which we cannot elaborate on because it's really.
I can do quickly to fill in some of the gaps. Richard Hofstadter's essay of 1964, "The Paranoid Style of American Politics," is, if you teach American studies or American history, this is the classic treatment of paranoia, whether it is paranoid anti-communism, 19th century anti-Semitism or anti-Catholicism, or it is the kind of classic essay often cited, for example, in or glossed in discussions of QAnon at the moment for now. I thought your book actually was one of the rare books that handles Hofstadter's essay in a thoughtful and historically specific way. This is one of these texts that's, familiar to an American scholar, less familiar perhaps to a European writer. And ultimately, Hofstadter made a pathology of the paranoid expression. If you were, to summarize Sander's point, the war is such a trauma that it opens up these psychic energies that then manifest themselves in pernicious pathological ways. And so the pathologization of the paranoid mind, often also the populist mind, that was Hofstadter's interpretation as a tragic-minded liberal. Then you review the counter-argument, which tries to say, which in a way, like depathologize, which tries to depathologize that conspiratorial imagination. I wonder if you'd like quickly finish that.
So when I did like the theory of conspiracy theories, I found I'm sure there's been a whole explosion in the last 2 years, which I haven't seen, but there was a real attempt to sort of say, don't pathologize these beliefs, understand them in context. Like these aren't dangerous beliefs. There's very specific reasons for it, whether it be mistrust of government or the psychic rupture over history. And don't even take, honestly, they became much more like religious beliefs. And these researchers were sort of urging me, like the reader, to frame them like that. And ultimately, I sort of reject them because I do feel there's a danger there that shouldn't be ignored.
So that comes, so that epiphany, which is one of the more, that is a kind of political realization. That's an ideological epiphany in the book, or it comes across that way. Calling the pathology a pathology, and it comes midway through the book in this section, and then there's the rest of the book, which then does ironically become its own form of treasure hunting. And I think I've identified the formal logic of it, where you do have to use this pathological form in order to tell your story to a different end. Does that register, or have I overread?
I think it registers, but I don't entirely understand.
In the sense that you identify the genre of paranoid treasure hunting as a pathological genre, an attempt to reclaim something that in fact is loaded with surrogation and projection, and is a kind of, requires one to go off of a deep end and lose oneself, or lose one's sanity. But you are ultimately humane to those figures. You don't, like, this is a quite humane book. There are very few true villains in it, I think, maybe.
I think I agree,
Yeah, it's also a ambivalent book.
Yeah.
There's a
Maybe I'm
the villain. Maybe you might be, in a way, the villain. Not really, you're not actually the villain. But then you do have to ironically adopt that genre of, it does become a treasure hunting. It does become, it's not pathological, but in this kind of meta way. It's a meta.
Yeah, I think one of the most interesting but also most challenging part of this book is that it's in a genre that I find, in a couple of genres, I really love this melancholy tournament of genres. That was my rejected subtitle for the book.
That'll be the
this idea
title
of like, writing within a genre that doesn't, I feel, is flawed, but yet it's the genre I'm constrained.
Yeah.
And so how do you push against it without breaking it? Or if you break it, you don't really break it, because especially once you become self-aware, and then it just becomes like a recursive mess.
And which genre here? This is the genre that you're uncomfortable with is
this discovery,
the Jewish family memoir, the return to Europe, the Altenheim.
And also the idea of going to find something, especially like that has familial meaning and spiritual meaning and resonance. And you're like, because those genres are very familiar in a lot of ways, and I'm very uncomfortable with it, but I'm also doing it. And so, like, there's not a really solution other than to expose oneself. They're going to say, like, okay, here's the mess. And what do you do with it? I don't know. And maybe some people get alienated by it. And I'm like, that's good.
Maybe you should do some of the distinctions we found.
That's a good idea.
Yeah?
Okay. This is eventually I also I think we should have you can tell the story of Menachem Kaiser, the figure, just for those who don't know it. But this is a book that operates in its writing on...
Tell it. Sorry.
Okay,
Wait,
before we do these
just
distinctions,
everybody knows it.
to fill in the gap, the
what-
story of Abraham Kaiser, since you did mention the new family member, just
Oh, so
the figure who
So basically, I'll take one step back and say about Project Riza a little bit.
Yeah.
And so Project Riza were these series of 7, at least as far as we know, 7 underground complexes built by the Nazis using mostly Jewish slave labor towards the end of the war. This was maybe the largest infrastructure project in the world up until that point. And so this was, none of these tunnels or underground structures were completed, but the ones closer to completion are square kilometers in size. We're talking like hundreds of meters long, 20-meter high ceilings, multi-levels. You're basically subterranean neighborhoods. Now, what makes them, they're already very strange and enigmatic, but what like puts them over the top is that there is virtually no primary documentation. As in, we do not have any real solid documentary evidence as what the Germans were planning to do with these tunnels.
Very suspicious.
Very strange. And then like the stories that we do have are like from like locals are that the Germans would make these concentric circles of soldiers and shoot anyone on sight who'd even approached. And the memory, like the memory of like how secretive these were persisted for like 20, 30 years in these villages, that people who knew about it still didn't want to talk about it even years after the war. And so basically because there's no, let me tell actually quickly the story of when I'm hanging out with the treasure hunters for the first time.
Yes.
And so, you know, they showed me these tunnels and they're being all real cool and macho with their camo and their mustaches, and we're drinking beer and we're just having a good time. And I'm a wimp. I'm like very polite, I'm a Canadian. And so I'm asking them like very easy questions. You know, tell me about your job, about the things you found. And then, but I brought 2 friends with me, another writer and a photographer. And my writer friend, a really close friend named Maya, she has a lot more chutzpah than I do, a lot more nerve. And she asked a much harder question, one I wouldn't have, you know, the guts to ask. She's like, you know, you guys are all very cool. You guys are all very macho. But what about the fact that 14,000 Jews died while digging these tunnels? Like, what about that? How does that affect the story and how you relate to these places? And they got very, very animated and like started speaking very rapidly in Polish. And I don't speak Polish, and so I didn't know what was happening, but I'm kind of used to that. And so I just sort of, you know, went like this, got a beer, and waited for the translation. But while they were talking rapidly in Polish, I started hearing my last name. I started hearing Kaiser, which they did not know my last name, so they were not speaking about me. So I started hearing, I don't know if you guys have had this, George, you may have had this experience when moving here for the first time.
Yes.
Like in a foreign language, you start hearing your name.
Yeah.
And it's weird. At first you think you misheard, but then it starts pinging like a radar. And you're like, okay, wait, what's going on? And so eventually I stopped them, and I was like, who are you talking about? And they're like, well, we're talking about Abraham Kaiser. You don't know? They were very kind of surprised that I didn't know. I said I'd never heard of them. And they explained that Abraham Kaiser was one of these Jewish slave laborers who wrote a diary while working on the tunnels. And the story of the diary is really remarkable, and we'll get to it in a second. And he survived, and he ended up going after the war on a bicycle that he borrowed from the woman who had saved him, the German woman who saved him, from camp to camp, collecting these notes. And he brought it to a Polish editor, and it was published in Poland in the early 60s. Now, once that diary became more widely known, because there is no primary documentation for the Riza project, this diary became essentially the primary document for the Riza project. And it was embraced by the treasure hunter community, and it's reprinted. They all studied it. I would subsequently go on to meet treasure hunters who've read it more than 40 times. I've gone to, I've met multiple treasure hunters who followed the pilgrimage from camp to camp. And it's something they've all like basically memorized. And so that's sort of why he's such a mythological sacred figure, and why I, as his quote-unquote grandson, was brought in as like, wow, you know, Abraham Kaiser's kid is here. And so Abraham Kaiser's story, so I knew that for a few years, and that's all I knew. And I read his diary, and there's very, very little that's personal in there. He basically, it starts in 1943, and it ends in 1945, and there's nothing before and there's nothing after. And so I really had no sense of who he was, except this one document that's very close. He mentions his wife and his son, who are both murdered in Auschwitz, but very little reflection of pre-war and very little like future facing. But I ended up finding out quite a bit more about him. So Eventually, I tracked down his family in Israel, and I flew to Israel, and I met, he had a sister and a brother who survived. And so I met this entire family who filled in a lot of the details. But then I would say the story really opened up when they told me that the German woman who had saved him, her children were still alive. And so I flew to Germany to speak to the kids, and they all remembered him. They were there. And they started really, look, this is, I don't care, it's a spoiler, fine. And so they referred to him as father. They called him Papa. And what had happened that not only was, in the memoir, in the last month of the war, he runs away from the camp, he meets a German woman, he begs to be saved. She says yes, the name is never given. She brings him down, hides him in a box meant for storing potatoes for a month. It's like 3 paragraphs later, a Russian soldier opens the box, you're free, and he's like, wow. And then, end of story. And you're like, okay, that's it. But if actually he stayed, him and this woman had an affair, they became lovers, and he stayed for 1 year to 2 years with them. And the irony, there's an irony that, you know, history can always be counted on, that her husband was in Italy at the time, serving in the German army, and he went missing. And so he died on the day right before it was liberated in 1945. And so she was keeping alive the Jewish prisoner while her husband was murdered. And and this woman, her name is Gertrude Froelich, for some reason the death notice of the German soldier, the husband, got lost. And the family wasn't officially notified of his death until 1992. And so this woman, and she never remarried, Abraham left in 1948. The kids told me that they wanted to get married, but she wouldn't go to Israel and he wouldn't go to Germany. And the family was forcibly expelled from Silesia, which had become Poland. And yeah, the woman, she died in 1999, 6 months after being recognized by Yad Vashem as a righteous among the nations. And I found this story to be like, this to me is maybe the real treasure of the book, which I really kind of stumbled into and found this like fantastic and complicated and really challenging love story between this German woman and the Jewish prisoner that persisted in that family till this day. And like the kids told me, I showed them a picture, the one very famous picture of Abraham, and he's in Israel. He has he's smoking a cigarette in a cool chair, and they told me that she kept it on her wall for the rest of her life. And so she had these these two men, her husband Alexander and her lover Abraham. That those were sort of the pillars of her life.
Sounds that's the thing you found there. That's
yeah.
Because in the book he finds a lot. There comes up with a lot, but
he finds a lot of stuff. But this is bigger than stuff.
And even the story that you're now telling is not the story that is actually being written down in that diary.
Nope.
So it's a story that you hear from various people. Everything that you can touch, that you can read, you can find out afterwards that it's not real, that there's another story behind it, that it's fake. And the thing that starts as just a story that you just hear somewhere, that's what closest to you. That's more truth to you.
I think that was the most unexpected thing I found. And I found some weird things. I mean, a lot of weird things happen in this book, and also off the page. Like, it was a lot of strange people, a lot of strange adventures. But I never in a million years expected to find. But even though it's right there, do you know what I mean? Yeah. When I reread Abraham's diary after meeting the kids, you could see it a little bit in the words. You could see, like, in phrases like, the way I wrote it in the book, I think the sentence is, he smuggled his post-war affection into his wartime diary. He smuggled it in there in the language. And like, I don't know why he edited it out, or he felt embarrassed, or maybe it was too challenging for the 50s in Israel. I don't know. But it's something that it was like falling down a hole.
Because here we should mention that the narrative itself was published twice, once in Polish and once in Hebrew. Itself a rather strange publishing history. I don't know if you want to fill.
Yeah, as like a writer, I found this to be the most interesting. Yeah. I don't know if my readers find it the most interesting, but like Basically, Abraham left, he ran to Israel, he brought with him a manuscript and was published in Israel in 1952 and immediately ignored and forgotten.
Yeah.
And like
Quite early in the history of the Holocaust.
Yes, so one of the very, very
Yeah.
early and very important Holocaust memoirs because it's one of the primary documents we have for a whole bunch of concentration camps with basically a very little documentation otherwise, and for the and for the Project Riza. And, but it was ignored. It took me 2 years to find a copy. And I may or may not have stolen it from the University of Toronto. It does not matter. But it was,
nobody's recording this or anything.
It's fine. And COVID, I think, freed all our university debt. And then, so you have that book, which is like, and they're basically the same book with some interesting difference, but essentially the same. So you have the story existing on two different planets, if you will. And so on one, it's completely ignored and forgotten in Hebrew, and that legacy dies. And then another you have in Polish, which it's celebrated and reprinted and like studied, but for the reasons that the author probably never intended. For reasons for like treasure, for literal treasure, they mine the words, they treat it like a treasure map. And so I was very struck by these, like the same text existing on two different planes and with different legacies and different audiences. I try to track down all that stuff. I tried to track down like the editor of the Polish one. I tried, and it's just like a whole mess. There's like a note in the back that like sort of like a weird little diversion of like how I tried to chase this down.
Because he also says he himself can't make a book out of it, because it starts with all these notes. I didn't quite understand it. He used old bags.
The scraps of cement packaging. He would steal these scraps that the cement for the tunnels was used, and he stole a pencil. And in the book, more than once, he says this pencil is the greatest thing he owns, his most valued treasure. And he writes these scraps, and then he was transferred from camp to camp 8 different times. And so he would take the scraps and nail them to the underside of the latrine, where they stayed until after the war, where he borrowed a bicycle from Gertrude and went from camp to camp. And to me, that was like the most striking image. Just him on a bicycle, going to the camp, some of which were already destroyed. Yeah. The Germans would destroy some of them as soon as they left, but going to these sites or the actual camps and digging up, like literally digging up these like scraps of cement that were written in Yiddish, and then bringing it to this Polish guy. And they worked on it for 2 years.
And they needed to bring the facts. It's like the Jorge Semprún book, Alive for Literature. Yeah. They needed to bring the facts in the story. He needed to make, the Polish guy needed to make a story out of it.
Yeah.
The Polish editor, the editor of the thing, yeah.
Their relationship is elusive to me. I don't understand it. It's a confusing one because he left and they're not in touch, and I didn't understand how they cannot be in touch after working on this memoir. And I don't know if they had a falling out. I don't know if they had a fight. When Abraham publishes it in Israel, he doesn't mention the editor at all, even though he had a critical role. And when it gets published in Poland in 1962, Abraham's alive. He doesn't die until the 70s. Mm-hmm. The Polish editor's like, I don't know where he is. I haven't heard from him. I hope he's still alive.
Yeah.
And it's a very strange, very, very odd.
Are you going to bring it into English?
Yeah. So I hired a translator for my own research, and then there was a tremendous amount of interest in that book, and it's coming out in English hopefully next year.
Great.
It's interesting that story of the creation of that narrative, writing it on the cement packages and burying it and attaching it under the latrines. It's, in a way, not believable. There's something about this that, it might be. Quite separately, I remember reading a book from 1947 that mentioned a survivor of Buchenwald saying that he had kept his spirits up by writing. He had kept his spirits up by rewriting the poems of John Keats from memory on. Now it was something about he kept his spirits up by writing something on the scraps of Keats poems that the Nazis had sent to Buchenwald to be used as toilet paper. This kind of insane image of literature in concentration camp or literary training death camp, which itself is a trope of the Holocaust memoir. If you think of the Prima Levi, I have to remember Dante, I have to remember these things. So that's and there's a genre element that I don't actually think that's true. I don't think that the Nazis they did a lot of, that required a strange, well, in any case, there is the interesting unknowability of the text, but in this book, it is one of several things that serves as an allegory for writing itself. Kind of not to be too fine point on it, but which, of these different models of literary production that you come across, which ones most resonated with your own writing of the book? You have to write this book. Did you, are you piecing it together in some ways? You have these interesting things of sneaking the recorder into the Polish courtroom. You have these other, other ways of recording the story that are... Yeah,
it's a very flattering question, because at the moment it's a mad scramble. Yeah. What George is referencing, so I had it, in court, I went to give testimony about my grandfather's building, and I was like, there's no way I'm not recording this. And so I snuck, I think illegally, but I'm not sure, my voice recorder, I think maybe it was even this jacket, in the jacket, and recorded it, and then the chapter is a straight transcript. I was like, there's no way for me to do this better. The absurdity is really captured there. But yeah, it's sort of a mad scrabble. And what ends up breaking is the certain forms just don't work to tell certain stories. And the big takeaway was the prevalence of myth throughout all our different modes. And so when we talk about history, and it gets complicated when I come from a place that really values quote-unquote Holocaust history. It's a sacred truth, but the role of myth is still there. Mm-hmm. And you have to treat it very delicately, because people will get very nervous but it's there. All these stories, a lot of them either aren't true or have been exaggerated or been warped, and that was a lesson I had to learn a million times, and how to treat it. And eventually you're there's myth and history, and they're hopelessly entangled, and then the question becomes much more about us. We're not going to disentangle them. Mm-hmm. The question is, how do we receive and then transmit these whatever you want to call them, these stories.
Mm-hmm. There's actually a chapter where you put in a lot of myths from centuries old until recently, and then you weave your own stories in between them. Yeah.
So that chapter, which I'm shocked the editors let, I guess you didn't have a choice once it was in. But basically that chapter, I have to really thank my Polish research assistant, because I can't read most of the original material. But basically, there's no context. They're just different myths throughout history. Some of them are true, some of them are not. But they go back all the way to the 1100s of stories about treasure. Because what I didn't know, that was the best way. In that area, in Silesia, and including wartime treasure, and some of which is true. And it includes the Golden Train, and includes my family. My grandfather hid stuff in the walls, and there's so many of these stories. But to me, it was the best way to make the argument of that, as George mentioned earlier, that this region has a long history of these kinds of stories. And even when we come up to the more fantastical recent Nazi stuff, you have to put it into historical context. But bigger than that is that the true stories and the fairy tales, they're very much correlated. And I didn't know how to make that argument. How do you make that argument in an interesting way, other than sort of just spilling all the stories out and letting someone else pick them up?
Yeah, and with having the story about the Holocaust in somewhere in the middle, and trying not to
let it overwhelm.
Yes.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. The distinctions.
Well, no, or how, I have no idea how we are doing on time, or whether we are, if there is a clock.
We only had 45 minutes, the publisher told us.
No, I didn't.
But maybe people will want to ask.
We might, now might be a good moment to open a floor for questions, if anyone has.
Is there anybody with a question?
Yeah, I'm wondering, how come you didn't know about Abraham? I mean, after the war, everybody knows who's dead and who's there, and how come you didn't know?
So,
good question.
It's a great question. I wouldn't know about Abraham. How would I know? But my father was convinced that he's convinced that they weren't actually related, because my father had never heard about him. my father felt like, how could it be that my grandfather had a first cousin who lived in Israel, and then he never heard about him? And my father was actually incredulous to the point of disbelieving my research until it became clear, another like remarkable, there's a whole other story that only got touched upon in the book, that Abraham had a brother named Chaskel. Chaskel had a wild story. He ran away, and when he was a teenager, he was like a rebellious teenager. I guess rebellious teenager meant something different because, I was a rebellious teenager, but he ran away on a boat. And so he was a stowaway on a boat, went to Argentina in the late 30s, his story is crazy. He was like, he didn't speak the language, and then became like a professional boxer. That eventually started an import-export business that was successful enough that he was like hanging around with Pinochet. Yeah. So,
but there's another reason. Your grandfather did not tell a lot to his children.
Yeah.
And he had a reason for that. And in the book you talk about that there was no nostalgia implanted by him on his children.
Yeah, I think one of the things that was hard for me to relate, that my father sort of really taught me in a way, was that, but after the war, I think there was a real emphasis on just being normal. And like, it wasn't an unusual thing. Everyone in the community was a Holocaust survivor. It wasn't unusual, it wasn't something prized, there wasn't this desperation to seize all those memories. Yeah. There was just like, my father, the way he puts it, he's like, he did not know about the concept of grandparents. He didn't know anyone with grandparents. And so it was just, it settled into normal. My grandfather, he was, struggling to make a living. That was where the emphasis on struggling to raise a family. There wasn't like, now let's sit around and talk about my wartime experience. And then he died very young. He died in his 50s, in his early 50s. And so, like, as opposed to my grandmother, and she died in 2005, in the later years of her life, really because of her grandkids, were like, talk about the war. And so, but back to your question, once I told my father about this crystal company, my father actually remembered. He's like, we have Kaiser crystal in the house. And so we have this big, beautiful vase and these little, beautiful shot glasses that Haskell had brought to Toronto. And so at that point it became clear, but I don't know why my father didn't know about him. It's a question that I don't have a good answer for.
Yeah, my question.
Sure.
When did you realize that you were writing a book? Because initially you were trying to locate your grandfather's possession.
It's a great question. So when I initially began the process of reclaiming, I was very adamant that I wasn't going to write a book about this for all the reasons we talked about at the beginning. I was like, there's no way to write a book like this interestingly. There's no way to write it honestly. And I'm going to be stuck in a genre that between you, me, and everyone listening, I hate. I don't like this genre, and I didn't want to be like pigeonholed in that like space as that kind of writer. So I was like, no way, I'm not touching it. I'll have a personal and meaningful experience, and I'll become a better person or whatever, or have a great dinner party conversation. But I'm not writing a book. And then I met the treasure hunters and learned about Abraham Kaiser, and the story got so weird and so interesting that I felt I had to at least try. And also at the time I was in grad school, doing an MFA in fiction writing, and there's a real, this is like, I'm sort of peeling back the curtain here, there's a real emphasis on like what's next in your career. And I felt, I had a story here. I had a story that could interest people, and so I was like, let me try to write a book proposal. And so I wrote, and then it sort of took off from there. And then I was committed. I wasn't thrilled about it. I felt like I signed up for something that I was going to have a really unpleasant time doing, and I was right. It really wasn't fun. But it sort of happened step by step. But the book came when I realized I was related to Abraham Kaiser, and I was a celebrity among the treasure hunters. That's something that doesn't happen every day. Yeah.
A weird sort of like celebrity or a totem or some kind of symbol for them.
Kind of a mascot.
Yeah, I mean, that is the part that I think is poignant, where you have these treasure hunters who themselves have an agonized relationship to the Nazi past, war, so much historical surrogation to have to have you sign their book as something like a Jewish mascot whom they have put on a curious pedestal that you yourself don't feel that you don't want to occupy and have no emotional connection.
What George is referring to is that the treasure hunters would bring me Abraham's book to sign. I would sign this book. And it was so weird because it's a Holocaust memoir. They're like giving me this Holocaust memoir and sign it. I'm like, sure. Like I am not one to say no to signing a book, even if it's not mine. But
because it's sacred to them, you don't want to be rude.
It was so
sacredness,
weird and strange.
You know, what
weird
can never be rude to someone else's sacredness, even when it's the bizarre sacred. I mean, that's one of the funny. That's where it becomes. You know, there's an element of manners. It's a kind of comedy. That's where it becomes, you know, darkly comic in its way, as these negotiating manners of this world.
There's like an irony, I think, throughout the book of like, when you care so much about something that's a symbol, do you lose sight of what the symbol represents? And I think we do that a lot. And they do it. They're like, look, we care so much about this one Jew, and they're like, okay, but are you being sufficiently sensitive to the entire Jewish experience? Or are you sort of allowing this as a stand-in?
You write about this and then talk about sentimentality.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, there was a real question of sentimentalism that I really struggled with.
More questions? Look, it's 6 o'clock. It's perfect.
We nailed it?
Yeah?
It appears that we started on time and we ended on time.
Yeah. Okay. I'd like to thank you very much. It was a joy reading the book. I can't say a joy. It's also, I felt also caught a bit. I was also being with I have a cultural obsession with the Nazis, I think, like you described.
So do we all.
We all have.
I'm gonna say my book in Dutch. I've been practicing the nalatenschap. Nalatenschap.
Nalatenschap.
It's very helpful when I hear George say it. Nalatenschap. Yeah.
It's true, I am the best Dutch speaker in the room. Absolutely.
Yeah.
No, it is a wonderful book.
It's a wonderful book, and really, it's a very fast read. It's like really.
And I so appreciate it.
I think with you're telling us about the mixture of the genres, it seems more difficult than it actually is when you're reading it.
Absolutely,
Yeah,
it's
so
like, but I didn't want to say it's a suspense literary thriller too much because, but it reads like a thriller. But it's also there's a lot of philosophy in it in the end. So.
Again, thank you guys, and thank you to everyone at the Spout 25 and to Jasper and the whole team at Thomas Raab.
Well, thank you, George, and thank you, Sander, for doing the interview. Thank you, Menachem, to be here to do this public interview. Thank you for coming over here and being here in person, and everybody at home. I don't know where the camera is. So I hope to see you next time. Please read the book. It's called Plunder in English. It's called the Nalatenschap in Dutch, available from this Thursday on. So thank you. Enjoy.